Why ancient Chinese did not have a fundamental science. Two of the most important human sensors must be our eyes and ears, where Chinese characters were developed based on light transmission, while Western cultures were developed from sound transmitted language. This must be the reason why Western culture is more inclined to develop alphabetic type languages, while Eastern civilizations, such as the Chinese, developed a pattern form written language. Yet mathematics is a symbolic substituted language, for which we see that it is more inclined for Westerners to develop mathematics than for Easterners, for example, China. For example, as can be seen in Figure 1, by a set of Chinese characters with respect to translated English counterpart. Figure 1a shows a set of Chinese characters, and Figure B shows the corresponding English translation. From which, this must be the reason why virtually ancient Chinese did not have mathematics, although Chinese had invented the abacus, sophisticated games such as Go and Mahjong, and others as shown in Figure 2. Figure 2 shows some of the ancient invented devices: A, an abacus; B, Go; and C, Mahjong. From which we see that although the Chinese had an uninterrupted civilization for over 5,000 years, yet she has failed to create the kind of mathematics that Western civilization has developed. Since fundamental science, for example theoretical physics, is mathematically oriented, this is precisely the reason why ancient Chinese virtually did not have an analytic science that is mathematical. Since written language is an important attribute for a civilized culture, without a sophisticated written language, it can hardly develop into a higher civilized society. Western European languages were developed primarily on a symbolic substituted language, that is sound, while Chinese written characters were created based on a pictorial format, that is light transmission, which is a single syllable tonal language. This must be the reason that gave Europeans a more natural inclination to create a symbolic substituted mathematics. Apparently, it is very unlikely to implement Chinese characters for a symbolic substituted mathematics. Nevertheless, science is mathematically symbolic representation, which is precisely the reason why the ancient Chinese virtually did not have science. Symbolic representation of science. Without the implementation of symbolic substitution, principle of science would be very difficult to facilitate. For example, how can one communicate chemical elements by Chinese characters, in which we see that without using symbolic substituted chemical elements, that is oxygen, hydrogen, carbon, with their single letters OHC, it will be more difficult to communicate with the Chinese language. Moreover, without those simple mathematical attributes, for example, the integral, the summation, the delta, the approximation, it will need a lot of more description to explain in plain texts, in which we see that It will take a lengthy set of Chinese characters to facilitate simple laws of science as depicted in Figure 3. Figure 3 shows a simple symbolic equation, E equals mc squared, but it will take a lengthy set of Chinese characteristics to describe, as depicted in Figure B. Since fundamental laws and principles are presented in symbolic substituted form, it can be seen why it is extremely difficult to describe them in Chinese written language, which is precisely why ancient China virtually did not have mathematics, because it was very unlikely and unnatural for Chinese to adopt a set of mathematical attributes to create mathematics. Ancient Chinese knew addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, and had invented the abacus to facilitate the calculations. Yet Chinese failed to symbolize addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, even though ancient Chinese did have arithmetic, yet it is not even close to the number theory of the West. Nevertheless, ancient Chinese had invented several viable technologies such as the compass, paper, dynamics, and rockets. Chinese had failed to discover principles of fundamental sciences, such as gravitational law, law of entropy, law of energy, and many others. The failure to discover fundamental principles were mainly due to Chinese written characters, which is not a type of alphabet like European languages. Nevertheless, if Chinese had created a set of symbolic attributes needed for mathematics, then there is no reason why Chinese would not invent the kind of science like Westerners, from which we see that it is her pictorial characters that had prevented ancient Chinese to develop the kind of symbolic attributes for her mathematics. Yet this is a kind of written language that holds China as a nation, as a people. Without it, China may not have held together as a nation and as a unique civilization for thousands of years. It is more likely that it would be fragmented into several nations of different dialects as European nations. Nevertheless, science is a language speaking for the truth. Any disadvantage is not meant to be inferior. In contrast, it makes a civilized nation smarter. Conclusion. In conclusion, we see that it is the attributes of Chinese written languages that has prevented ancient Chinese from inventing mathematics, but is by no means a disadvantage in terms of mathematical science. On the contrary, China is one and only one civilization that has survived as a nation and as a people for over 5,000 years of uninterrupted history. By transforming Chinese culture and importing mathematical sciences from the West, China has benefited its people as well as a nation, from which we see that a great advance has been taking place in modern China without losing a major part of Chinese cultural transformation. Surprisingly, It turns out to be a better China for her people and for the world by not giving up her fundamental cultural heritage for the sake of importing mathematical science.